In this video, I'm going to go over my top 10 moments from Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. But before I do that, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button and press the bell. That way you know every time I post a new video. So Halloween 3 gets a lot of hate because it's the one movie in the franchise that didn't feature Michael Myers as the main character. So John Carpenter's plan originally was to have Halloween be an anthology series. So 1978's Halloween would have been the only one to feature Michael Myers, and then every year from then on, there would be a completely different story in the anthology. Of course, he was forced into Halloween 2, but with that, he was given the okay to make Halloween 3 something completely different. And because of that, we get Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. Back when the movie first came out, a lot of fans were very upset because it had the title Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. So naturally with Halloween 3, they thought it would be picking up after part 2. So when people went out to theaters and didn't see Michael Myers in the movie, they were highly pissed off. I remember being a kid and watching this movie for the first time and expecting to see Michael Myers and getting through the entire movie and not knowing what the hell happened. If you're able to separate from the character of Michael Myers for a little bit and just enjoy this movie as a standalone movie that has nothing to do with the Halloween franchise and maybe just call it Season of the Witch, which is its subtitle. I think even had it been called Season of the Witch and not Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, it probably would have done much better in theaters. It probably would have gotten better reviews, but people hated it just for the fact that Michael Myers wasn't in it. I was even one of those people. But then a few years back, I watched this movie again for the first time in so long and realized that this is actually one of the best Halloween movies in the franchise. Now, I'm not saying I put it at the very top of the list with, Halloween's 1 and 2, but it's actually a really good movie. So this list right here is for those of you who have seen the movie already. We're going to go through the top 10 moments. So in my number 10 spot for best moments of Halloween 3 is going to be the Halloween 1 commercial playing at the bar. Now, I found this to be such a cool moment because this is when we realized that these two movies don't exist in the same universe. So Dan Chalice is at the bar, he's having a drink, and they're showing like cartoons or something like that on the TV, and he asks the bartender to change the channel. And when he does, what we see is the Halloween 1978 commercial. And this is one of those moments in the movie that I always just really enjoy. There's that separation of the two universes, but also it ties them together at the very same time, if that makes sense. Especially later in the movie when Dan Chalice is tied to the chair and we see the movie playing on the screen. So they found some very unique ways to separate the two universes and tie them together at the same time, and it's just one of my favorite things. So in my number 9 spot is going to be when Dr. Dan Chalice's friend back at the office is trying to find evidence from that car explosion that happened at the beginning of the movie. Now, if you remember, one of the robots goes inside of the car, covers himself in gasoline, and lights the car on fire and blows it up. Well, she's expecting to find human remains in all of this damage that she's looking through, but she's not finding any. She's finding mechanical pieces. Now, once she figures it out, it's at the same time that one of the robots finds her and stops her from making that call and puts a drill right through her head. In my number 8 spot is going to be the homeless man that gets killed inside of the junkyard. This is right after he just finished talking to Dr. Dan Chalice, and he's talking really bad about Colonel Cochran and what he's done to the town, and he's saying that he's going to burn down the Silver Shamrock factory one day. Well, of course, there's eyes and ears all over the town coming from the factory, and they hear what he said, and it only took a few moments for this to catch up with him. He's approached by two of the robots, who then begin to tear his head straight off of his neck. Now, while the effects of this are pretty terrible, it's still one of the coolest scenes in the movie. In my number 7 spot is going to be when Dr. Dan Chalice gets into the fight with the robot. He thinks he's fighting another human being, but it's clear something's wrong here. He eventually overtakes him and starts to punch him in the chest. His hand goes right through his chest, but he realizes something doesn't feel right, so when he pulls his hand back out, he pulls out all of these wires and all this yellow goop is coming out of his face. And this is when Dan Chalice realizes that he's not dealing with human beings, and he already knew that something was wrong at the Silver Shamrock factory. But what he finds here really takes a toll on him to the point that it almost appears that he's going to faint. In my number 6 spot is going to be what they call the misfire. This is when Dan and Ellie are staying at the hotel. On the other side of the wall in the next room is Marge. She feels that she's not getting much help from the factory with her masks. The chip with the Silver Shamrock logo is falling off the back of it, so she attempts to repair it herself. But when she opens it up, she finds that there's a circuit board inside of it. So in an attempt to figure out what's going on with the Silver Shamrock chip, she pulls a pin out of her hair and attempts to poke at it and fiddle with the chip, maybe just to see what it is. Well, the chip activates in what Conal Cochran would later call a misfire, and a laser shoots out of the chip, completely tears her face apart. And I remember in the earlier versions of this movie, especially the TV versions, you don't get to see much of it. Her face is always covered. But on the later Blu-rays, we get to see how much damage was actually done due to the laser misfire. In my number 5 spot is when Dr. Dan Chalice is tied to the chair, and Conal Cochran just finished giving his big speech, and he turns the TV on, and the original Halloween movie is playing. Now, it's not so much that the Halloween movie is playing that puts it in my number 5 spot, but it's actually the music. So just as Conal Cochran finishes the speech, he turns on the TV, the movie's playing, the legendary music is playing in the background, and Conal Cochran stops. He looks over at Dan for just a few seconds, and then he says,
"And happy Halloween."
And this cues the best part of the music right at that very moment. Now, as Dan is trying to break free from being tied up on the chair, the music from the movie is playing in the background. It fit the soundtrack to this movie so well, it fit perfectly into this moment, that they didn't actually have to put in any soundtrack from Halloween 3. They were able to use Halloween 1. And the reason this is on my best moments list is not just because it was cool, but it also, once again, tied things together. Remember, this was supposed to be an anthology, so every year there would be a different Halloween movie. What this moment showed was that you can play the music from the first Halloween and it would work in other films. In my number 4 spot is when Dan figures out that Ellie's a robot. This is right after they make the escape from the Silver Shamrock factory. They're in the car and Dan is talking to Ellie and she's not responding to anything. Something is clearly off. So when he attempts to figure it out, she attacks him, causing them to veer off the road and crash into a tree. This causes a fight scene between the two, and he's figured out that she's a robot. He's ripped her arm off, he's now knocked her head off, and then the arm comes back and tries to choke him. It's a weird scene, but the fact of finding out that Ellie was a robot and creating this wonder of, was she a robot the entire time, or did they turn her into one after they took her from the motel earlier in the film? Now, I used to believe that they turned her into that, but kind of separating from that now, I look at it and I think, alright, in that short amount of time, they would have had to completely remove any human remains and replace them with mechanical, and I just don't see that happening. I think the entire time she was a robot, and maybe they activated her at this moment. My number 3 spot comes at the very end of the movie, and it's one of the most iconic scenes in the entire movie. It's one of the ones that everyone remembers. Most people put this in their number 1 spot, but this is the very end where he's calling up the television studios and he's trying to get them to take that commercial off the air because he knows what's about to happen if it plays.
God, it means the death of millions of people, everyone watching. Don't you understand that?
And he gets the commercial to stop, but then they change the channel and it's on another channel, so he tells them to take that one off, and then there's a third one, and just as he's screaming stop it that last time, the movie cuts to credits.
Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! Stop it!
So we have no idea if he was ever actually able to stop this tragedy from happening. Of course, we would never get a sequel to that moment because it was never intended to happen. It was supposed to be an anthology, so they would have went on to a completely different story and left us hanging on the edge of our seat, never knowing what would have happened. Just like they intended to do with Halloween 1 when Dr. Loomis finds that Michael is gone after he shot him. In my number 2 spot is when that annoying family's in a testing room at the Silver Shamrock factory, and the kid's got the pumpkin mask on, and he's watching the Silver Shamrock commercial, and as he's watching the commercial, his mask starts to deteriorate on his head. You see him grasping at the mask and trying to get it off, and something's going on, and he collapses. And what his parents see is a complete nightmare, and it's gross. The kid is clearly already dead, but there are snakes and crickets and all kind of bugs coming out of the mask. It's one of the most disgusting scenes in the movie, but it's also up there as one of the most memorable moments in this film. And coming in my number 1 spot for Halloween 3 Season of the Witch is going to be the Conal Cochran speech. This part of the movie is something I've never forgotten since the first time I saw it. I remember thinking how creepy this guy really is. This is when Cochran has Dan tied to the chair and he's giving him this speech about the Festival of Samhain, not Samhain. And he's telling Dan about how everyone thinks of Halloween as this time of the year where kids put on masks and they go out and beg for candy. And then he begins to describe what the Festival of Samhain is.
The Festival of Samhain. The last great one took place 3,000 years ago and the hills ran red.
And what the rituals are about and what that purpose is. And to me, this is the Dr. Loomis moment of this movie. I thought this speech was just as impactful and just as important as any Loomis speech in the franchise. And then that very end of the speech, after he turns on the movie, the Halloween music's playing in the background, and he says,
And Happy Halloween.
his face in that moment is one of the creepiest parts of the movie. So that's it for my 10 best moments of Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. Let me know in the comments what you guys think. What are some of your best moments? What are some of the worst moments? Is this one of the Halloween films that you don't watch because you don't like it and don't care to see it as part of the franchise? Or is this a must watch every Halloween like it is for me?